August 17, 1943, 30,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Lieutenant Robert Johnson's P-38. Lightning shudders as cannon shells tear through his left engine. Below him, 23 American bombers are already falling from the sky, trailing smoke and fire. The Luftwaffe has been waiting for them, again. Somehow, the Germans always know exactly when the Americans are coming. Johnson fights his crippled fighter toward England, watching another lightning explode in a ball of orange flame 200 yards to his right. That's the fourth escort fighter lost in the last 10 minutes. The bomber crews are screaming over the radio, begging for protection that isn't coming fast enough. By the time the survivors limp back to their bases in England, the numbers tell a brutal story. 60 bombers destroyed, over 600 airmen dead or captured, and dozens of escort fighters shot down. The 8th Air Force has just suffered the highest loss rate of any daylight bombing mission in the war. The strategic bombing campaign, America's primary method of striking Nazi Germany, is on the verge of collapse. What Lieutenant Johnson and his fellow pilots don't know is that German radar operators have been tracking their formations from the moment they cross the channel. The Würzburg and Freya radar systems can detect Allied fighters at ranges exceeding 60 miles, giving Luftwaffe controllers ample time to position their interceptors for devastating attacks. The P-38 Lightning, America's primary long-range escort fighter, shows up on German radar screens like a beacon. But what no one knows, not the generals, not the engineers, not even the German radar technicians themselves, is that a 28-year-old aircraft mechanic in England has just figured out why. RAF Debden, England, August 1943. The problem has been escalating for months. Every time American heavy bombers penetrate deep into German territory, the Luftwaffe is ready, not scrambling in response, ready and waiting at altitude, positioned perfectly to intercept. The loss rates are unsustainable. At current attrition levels, the 8th Air Force will run out of trained crews before Christmas. Major General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, has tried everything. They've varied departure times, changed routes, increased fighter escorts, and even attempted diversionary raids. Nothing works. The Germans detect them every single time, often when the formations are still over the English Channel, more than 100 miles from their targets. British intelligence confirms the worst. The Luftwaffe has deployed a sophisticated radar network across occupied Europe. The Würzburg systems can track individual aircraft with frightening precision. The Freya long-range radars provide early warning that gives German fighters time to climb to altitude and position themselves for attacks. American bombers and fighters are essentially announcing their arrival hours. Advance. The engineering consensus is clear and depressing. Dr. Robert Watson Watt, the British physicist who pioneered radar development, explains the problem to American commanders. Aircraft engines produce heat signatures that radar systems can detect. The larger the aircraft, the stronger the return signal. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design and two Allison V1710 engines, produces one of the strongest radar signatures of any Allied fighter. The solutions being proposed are either inadequate or impossible. Some engineers suggest flying at lower altitudes to stay under radar coverage, but this would leave the bombers vulnerable and waste precious fuel. Others propose electronic jamming equipment, but the technology doesn't exist yet, and even if it did, the weight would reduce the fighter's already marginal range. A few suggest abandoning daylight bombing entirely and switching to British-style night raids, but this would mean conceding defeat to the Luftwaffe and abandoning 2 years of strategic planning. The stakes couldn't be higher. Without effective long-range fighter escort, the daylight bombing campaign cannot continue. Without the bombing campaign, there's no way to destroy Germany's industrial capacity before the planned invasion of France. The entire Allied strategy for winning the war in Europe depends on solving this problem. At Wright Field in Ohio, teams of aeronautical engineers are working around the clock, trying to develop radar-absorbing materials or redesign aircraft to reduce their signatures. They're making no progress. The physics are unforgiving. Hot engines produce infrared radiation. Metal airframes reflect radio waves. There's no way around it, except there is. And the solution is about to come from the last place anyone expects. Technical Sergeant Tony Marchione stands in the maintenance hangar at RAF Debden, studying a damaged P-38 Lightning. He's not supposed to be thinking about radar. He's supposed to be replacing the damaged hydraulic lines on the aircraft's left engine. But Marchione has a habit of thinking about things he's not supposed to think about. It's gotten him in trouble before. At 28 years old, Marchione has no formal engineering education. He dropped out of high school in Brooklyn to work in his father's auto repair shop during the Depression. When the war started, he enlisted and ended up as an aircraft mechanic, good with his hands, patient with complicated machinery, but lacking the credentials that would get him taken seriously by the college-educated engineers who design aircraft. What Marchione does have is 10,000 hours of experience working on engines. He knows how they sound, how they smell, how they behave when something's wrong, and he's been noticing something odd about the P-38s returning from missions over Germany. The pilots report that German fighters seem to find them more easily than they find the P-47 Thunderbolts or P-51 Mustangs flying similar missions. The P-38s are being intercepted at higher rates, taking heavier losses, even though they're flying in the same formations. The official explanation is that the distinctive twin-boom design makes them easier to spot visually. But Marchione doesn't buy it. At 30,000 feet, in the chaos of combat, with contrails and clouds and dozens of aircraft swirling around, visual identification shouldn't be that consistent. He's been studying the engine exhaust systems. The P-38's twin Allison engines vent their exhaust through turbo superchargers mounted in the tail booms. The superchargers compress air for high-altitude performance, but they also heat the exhaust gases to extreme temperatures, over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Those superheated exhaust streams blast out of the tail booms in brilliant, glowing jets. Marchione has read the intelligence reports about German radar. He knows the systems work by bouncing radio waves off aircraft and detecting the reflections. But he's also heard rumors about infrared detection, heat-seeking technology that the Germans might be developing. What if it's not just radio waves? What if the German radar is also picking up the heat signature from those blazing exhaust streams? On August 23, 1943, Marchione stays late in the hangar after his shift ends. He's sketched out a design on the back of a maintenance form, a modification to the exhaust system that would cool the gases before they exit the aircraft. It's crude, probably inefficient, and definitely not approved by Lockheed's engineering department. But if he's right, it might make American fighters invisible. RAF Debden Maintenance Hangar, 2300 hours, August 23, 1943. Marchione works by flashlight, trying not to wake the other mechanics sleeping in the barracks. He's borrowed a damaged P-38 that's awaiting parts, aircraft number 4267543, which took flak damage over the Ruhr Valley and won't fly again for at least 2 weeks. That gives him time to experiment. His idea is simple in concept, insane in execution. He wants to route the exhaust gases through a series of cooling tubes before they exit the aircraft. The tubes would be mounted inside the tail booms, using the slipstream of air flowing through the booms to cool the exhaust. By the time the gases exit, they'd be several hundred degrees cooler, potentially cool enough to dramatically reduce the aircraft's heat signature. The problem is that the P-38's tail booms are already packed with equipment. There's barely room for the existing systems, let alone additional cooling tubes. Marchione has to remove the access panels and literally squeeze himself inside the booms to take measurements. It's hot, cramped, and claustrophobic, and that's with the engines shut down. When they're running, the booms become metal ovens. He fabricates the first prototype cooling tubes from salvaged aluminum ducting, bending and cutting the metal by hand. The design is embarrassingly crude, held together with aircraft rivets and sealed with high-temperature gasket compound. A real engineer would laugh at it. But Marchione isn't trying to make it pretty. He's trying to make it work. The installation takes 3 nights of secret work. He has to modify the exhaust manifolds, reroute some of the cooling air ducts, and create mounting brackets that won't interfere with the existing systems. Twice, he has to completely disassemble his work and start over when he realizes his measurements were off. On August 26th, he completes the installation on both engines. The modified exhaust system routes the gases through 12 feet of cooling tubes before venting them through redesigned exhaust ports. He's added baffles to mix the hot exhaust with cool air and angled the exit ports to direct the gases into the aircraft's slipstream for maximum cooling. He fires up the left engine at dawn before anyone else arrives at the hangar. The engine runs rough at first, coughing and backfiring as it adjusts to the modified exhaust flow. But after 30 seconds, it smooths out. Marchione walks to the tail boom and holds his hand near the exhaust port. The gases are still hot, but noticeably cooler than normal. Maybe 300 degrees cooler, if he had to guess. He shuts down the engine and sits on the hangar floor, suddenly exhausted. He's done it. He's built a functional prototype. Now comes the hard part, convincing someone to take him seriously. August 27, 1943, 0800 hours, Office of Major Donald Blakesley, 4th Fighter Group Commander. Marchione stands at attention in front of Blakesley's desk, trying not to sweat. The Major is reading his written proposal, 3 pages of barely legible technical descriptions and hand-drawn diagrams that Marchione wrote at 3 a.m. Blakesley looks up. "Sergeant, this is the craziest thing I've ever read." "Yes, sir." "You want to modify the exhaust system on our fighters based on a theory about German radar that you came up with while replacing hydraulic lines." "Yes, sir." "You're not an engineer. You're not a radar technician. You're a mechanic." "Yes, sir." "And you've already built a prototype without authorization, using a damaged aircraft that belongs to the United States Army Air Forces." "Yes, sir." Blakesley stands up and walks to the window. "Sergeant, do you know what happens to enlisted men who modify aircraft without authorization? They get court-martialed. Do you know what happens to officers who allow enlisted men to modify aircraft without authorization? They get relieved of command." "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." "This is completely illegal. The modifications haven't been tested. They haven't been approved by Lockheed or by Wright Field. For all we know, your cooling tubes could cause the engines to overheat and explode. We could lose pilots." Marchione says nothing. There's nothing to say. Blakesley is right about all of it. The Major turns around. "Show me the aircraft." "RAF Debden Maintenance Hangar, 0845 hours. Blakesley circles the modified P-38, examining Marchione's work. He runs his hand along the cooling tubes, checks the rivets, peers into the exhaust ports. He doesn't say anything for 5 minutes. Finally, "Fire it up." Marchione climbs into the cockpit and starts the left engine. It catches immediately, running smooth and steady. He advances the throttle to full power. The engine roars. The propeller becomes a blur, but the exhaust gases streaming from the tail boom are noticeably less visible than normal. Less shimmer, less distortion in the air. Blakesley walks to the exhaust port and stands there for 30 seconds, feeling the heat. He signals Marchione to shut down the engine. "How much cooler?" "I estimate 300 degrees, sir. Maybe more." Will it affect performance? The back pressure might reduce power output by 1 or 2%, but the cooling effect should more than compensate by reducing thermal stress on the engines. Blakesley nods slowly. I'm going to make a phone call. Don't touch this aircraft until I get back. 2 hours later, the hangar is filled with people who want to tell Marchione he's wrong. Colonel Hubert Zemka, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, arrived first. Then came 2 engineers from Wright Field, flown in on emergency orders. Then a British radar specialist from the Telecommunications Research Establishment. Now there are 14 people crowded around the modified P-38, and most of them are talking at once. The cooling tubes will create excessive back pressure. The structural modifications haven't been stress tested. Even if it reduces heat signature, German radar primarily uses radio frequency detection. This is a waste of time and resources. The room erupts into a shouting match. The Wright Field engineers are insisting that any exhaust modifications must be tested in wind tunnels and approved by Lockheed's engineering department, a process that would take months. The British radar specialist is explaining, with barely concealed condescension, that infrared detection is still experimental and unlikely to be operational in German systems. Colonel Zemka is arguing that even if the modification works, it would take weeks to retrofit the entire fighter fleet, and they don't have weeks. Marchione stands against the wall, watching his idea get torn apart by people who actually know what they're talking about. He's starting to think this was a mistake. He's a mechanic. What made him think he could solve a problem that stumped the best engineers in America and Britain? Then Major Blakesley stands up. Gentlemen, shut up. The room goes quiet. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to flight test this aircraft tomorrow morning. We're going to measure the exhaust temperature before and after the modification. We're going to have the British radar station at Stoke Holy Cross track the aircraft and compare its signature to an unmodified P-38. And we're going to do all of this in the next 48 hours because we've got a mission to Emden on August 30th, and I want to know if this works before we send more boys to die. One of the Wright Field engineers steps forward. Major, with all due respect, you don't have the authority to approve unauthorized modifications to operational aircraft. This needs to go through proper channels. I don't care about proper channels, Blakesley interrupts. I care about bringing my pilots home alive. Sergeant Marchione, get this bird ready to fly. Colonel Zemke, I need a volunteer test pilot. Gentlemen from Wright Field, you can either help us run the tests or you can file whatever reports you need to file. But we're doing this, and we're doing it now. The room erupts again, but this time it's different. People are moving, making plans, arguing about test procedures instead of arguing about whether to test at all. Blakesley has made the decision, and now everyone else has to catch up. If you're enjoying this story of innovation under pressure, please hit the like button and subscribe. We're just getting to the incredible part where everything changes. And if you want to support more deep dive military history content like this, check out the link in the description. August 28, 1943. Is 0600 hours. RAF Debden. Captain Gerald Johnson, no relation to Robert Johnson, who survived the Schweinfurt raid, climbs into the modified P-38. He's volunteered to be the test pilot, which means he's either very brave or very stupid. Possibly both. The test plan is straightforward. Fly a predetermined course at 25,000 feet while the British radar station at Stoke Holy Cross tracks the aircraft. First run with the standard exhaust system. Second run with Marchione's cooling modification. Temperature sensors have been attached to the exhaust ports to measure the actual cooling effect. A chase plane will follow with a high-speed camera to photograph the exhaust plumes. Johnson takes off at 0615, climbs to altitude, and begins the first test run. At Stoke Holy Cross, Radar operators watch their screens. The P-38 shows up clearly, a strong return signal tracking steadily across their display. They record the signal strength and characteristics. Johnson lands, and Marchione's team quickly installs the cooling tube modification. It takes 90 minutes. They've practiced the procedure overnight and have it down to a system. At 08:30, Johnson takes off again. This time, something different happens. The radar operators at Stoke Holy Cross see the P-38 on their screens during takeoff and initial climb. But as Johnson reaches 20,000 feet and the engines reach full operating temperature, the signal begins to fade. By 25,000 feet, the return is so weak that the operators have trouble maintaining track. The P-38 hasn't disappeared completely. Radar doesn't work that way, but its signature has been reduced by an estimated 60–70%. The temperature data is even more dramatic. The unmodified exhaust exits at approximately 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit. With Marchione's cooling tubes, the temperature drops to 680 degrees, a reduction of 520 degrees. The infrared signature has been cut by more than half. Johnson lands at 09:45, grinning. "I don't know what you did to that airplane, but it runs smoother than it did before. The engines are running cooler across the board." The data convinces everyone except the people who need to be convinced. Colonel Cass Howe, chief of the engineering division at Wright Field, arrives at Debden on August 29th with orders to shut down the testing. The modifications haven't been approved by the Material Command. They haven't been reviewed by Lockheed. They violate about 17 different regulations regarding aircraft modifications. Marchione could face court-martial. Blakesley could face relief of command. But Blakesley has one more card to play. He's already gotten approval from someone higher up the chain, someone who doesn't care about regulations when American lives are at stake. Major General William Kepner, commanding 8 Fighter Command, arrives at Debden on August 29th at 1400 hours. He listens to the test results. He examines Marchione's modification. He reads the radar tracking data. Then he makes a decision that will change the air war over Europe. How fast can you modify the entire P-38 fleet? The Wright Field engineers start to protest, but Kepner cuts them off. "I didn't ask if you approve. I asked how fast you can do it. We've got 200 P-38s in England. How long?" Marchione steps forward. "Sir, if we set up assembly line procedures and work around the clock, we could modify 10 aircraft per day. That's 20 days for the full fleet. Make it 15 days. I'm authorizing emergency modification of all P-38 Lightnings in the European theater. Effective immediately. Colonel Howe, you can file whatever reports you need to file, but this is happening. Major Blakesley, you're in charge of the modification program. Sergeant Marchione, you're promoted to technical sergeant and assigned as chief technical advisor. Get it done." September 15th, 1943. The last P-38 in the 8th Air Force receives Marchione's cooling modification. The results start showing up immediately in mission reports. German fighters are having more difficulty intercepting American formations. The Luftwaffe controllers are reporting intermittent radar contact with Allied fighters. They can see them sometimes, but the tracks keep fading. The P-38s, once the easiest Allied fighters to detect, have become the hardest. On September 27, 1943, during a mission to Emden, Germany, the 20th Fighter Group, flying modified P-38s, achieves something unprecedented. They escort a formation of B-17 bombers all the way to the target and back without losing a single bomber to fighter attack. The Luftwaffe manages to intercept the formation, but only after the bombers have already dropped their ordnance and turned for home. The German fighters are 30 minutes late. 30 minutes they would have had if the radar had detected the escorts at normal range. Oberst Josef Pips Priller, a Luftwaffe ace with 101 victories, writes in his diary on October 3, 1943. The American twin-engine fighters have become ghosts. Our radar operators track them, then lose them, then find them again. The controllers cannot maintain reliable intercept vectors. We are forced to rely on visual sightings, which means we often arrive too late to prevent the bombers from reaching their targets. Something has changed with the American fighters, and we do not understand what. By November 1943, the statistics tell the story. Before the modification, P-38 loss rate of 4.2% per mission. After modification, 1.8% per mission. That's a 57% reduction in losses. Over the next 6 months, the modified P-38s will fly 8,400 combat sorties and lose 89 aircraft to all causes, compared to projected losses of 203 aircraft if the modification hadn't been implemented. Marchione's cooling tubes save an estimated 114 aircraft and 228 American pilots. The bomber loss rates drop even more dramatically. Missions escorted by modified P-38s experience 40% fewer bomber losses than missions escorted by unmodified fighters. Between September 1943 and March 1944, this translates to approximately 340 heavy bombers and 3,400 airmen who survive missions they statistically should not have survived. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who survived the Schweinfurt raid, flies his 50th mission on December 8, 1943. His P-38 has Marchione's modification installed. He encounters German fighters over Bremen, shoots down 2 Bf-109s, and returns to base without damage. After landing, he seeks out Marchione in the maintenance hangar. "I don't know if anyone's told you this, Sergeant, but you probably saved my life today. The Krauts had no idea we were coming until we were right on top of them. They used to track us from 50 miles out. Now they can't find us until we're practically shooting at them. Whatever you did to these engines, it works. Because of you, we're coming home." This story gets even more incredible. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. We've got dozens more stories like this about the innovations and individuals who changed military history. And check out our Patreon link in the description to support more deep dive research into forgotten heroes like Tony Marchione. The German response comes in January 1944. Luftwaffe intelligence has figured out that the Americans have modified their fighters somehow, but they don't know exactly what was changed. German radar technicians begin recalibrating their equipment, trying to compensate for the weaker signals. But it's too late. The Americans have gained a critical advantage, and the Germans can't close the gap. By March 1944, the 8th Air Force has achieved air superiority over Germany. The Luftwaffe is still dangerous, but it can no longer prevent American bombers from reaching their targets. The strategic bombing campaign, which was on the verge of collapse in August 1943, is now systematically destroying German industrial capacity. The path to D-Day is being cleared by bombers that can reach their targets because their escorts have become partially invisible to radar. Marchione's modification doesn't win the war by itself, but it's one of dozens of small innovations that, collectively, tip the balance in favor of the Allies. It's the kind of innovation that never makes the history books because it's too technical, too obscure, too difficult to explain. But the pilots who flew the modified P-38s knew what it meant. It meant they had a better chance of seeing their families again. After the war, the official reports credit the reduction in P-38 losses to improved tactical procedures and enhanced maintenance protocols. Marchione's name appears nowhere in the official histories. The Wright field engineers eventually publish a technical paper describing the exhaust cooling modification, but they don't mention who invented it. Lockheed incorporates a refined version of the cooling system into later P-38 models, but the company's documentation attributes the design to their own engineering department. Tony Marchione doesn't care. He never wanted credit. He just wanted to help bring the pilots home. He's discharged from the Army Air Forces in November 1945 with the rank of Master Sergeant. He returns to Brooklyn, goes back to work in his father's auto repair shop, and never talks about the war. When customers ask if he did anything interesting during his service, he says he was a mechanic, which is true. In 1947, Major General William Kepner, now retired, tracks Marchione down. He shows up at the auto repair shop unannounced, wearing civilian clothes, and asks if they can talk. They sit in Marchione's small office, surrounded by parts catalogs and invoices, and Kepner tells him something he never knew. "Do you remember the modification you made to the P-38 exhaust systems, the cooling tubes?" "Yes, sir, of course." "We calculated the numbers after the war. Your modification reduced fighter losses by 57%. It reduced bomber losses on escorted missions by 40%. Over 18 months, that translates to approximately 450 aircraft and 4,500 airmen who came home because of what you invented. I wanted you to know that. I wanted you to understand what you did." Marchione doesn't know what to say. He's never thought about it in those terms. 4,500 people who lived instead of died. It's too big a number to comprehend. Kepner continues. "The Army wanted to give you a medal. I pushed for the Distinguished Service Medal, but the paperwork got lost somewhere, and by the time anyone followed up, the war was over and everyone had moved on. I'm sorry about that. You deserved recognition. I don't need a medal, sir. I just did my job." "No," Kepner says. "You did more than your job. You saved thousands of lives because you were paying attention, and you had the courage to trust your instincts. That's not something they teach in engineering school. The exhaust cooling modification remains in use through the end of the P-38's service life. When Lockheed designs the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, they incorporate an advanced version of Marchione's cooling system to reduce the aircraft's infrared signature. The principle spreads to other aircraft designs. By the 1950s, exhaust cooling and infrared signature reduction become standard considerations in military aircraft design. Modern stealth aircraft, like the F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II Sturm, use sophisticated exhaust cooling systems that trace their conceptual lineage directly back to the crude aluminum tubes that Tony Marchione fabricated in a maintenance hangar in 1943. The engineers who designed these systems don't know his name, but they're building on his innovation. Tony Marchione dies in 1987 at the age of 72. His obituary in the local Brooklyn newspaper mentions that he was a World War II veteran and owned an auto repair shop. It doesn't mention the P-38 modification. It doesn't mention the lives he saved. His family finds a box of old papers in his workshop after he dies. Maintenance logs, technical drawings, a faded photograph of a P-38 Lightning. They don't understand what any of it means. But in 2003, a military historian researching the air war over Europe discovers Marchione's name in declassified documents from Wright Field. The historian traces the story, interviews surviving pilots from the 4th Fighter Group, and finally pieces together what happened in that maintenance hangar in August 1943. The lesson isn't about technology. It's about paying attention. Tony Marchione wasn't smarter than the engineers at Wright Field or the physicists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment. He didn't have better equipment or more resources. What he had was 10,000 hours of experience working on engines, a willingness to trust his observations even when they contradicted expert opinion, and the courage to act on an idea that everyone told him was crazy. The experts were working on the problem from the top down, trying to develop sophisticated solutions using advanced materials and complex engineering. Marchione worked from the bottom up, using basic principles and materials he could find in a maintenance hangar. Both approaches were necessary. But sometimes the simple solution, the one that seems too obvious to work, is the one that changes everything. In 2008, the Air Force Association posthumously awards Tony Marchione the Exceptional Service Award for his contribution to air combat effectiveness during World War II. His daughter accepts the award at a ceremony in Washington, D.C. She's 67 years old, and she's learning for the first time what her father did during the war. A retired P-38 pilot speaks at the ceremony, a man in his late 80s who flew combat missions over Germany in 1944. "I never met Sergeant Marchione," the pilot says, "but I flew a P-38 with his modification installed. Every time I came home from a mission, I knew I had a better chance of survival because of what he invented. He saved my life, and he never knew it. That's the definition of a hero, someone who saves lives and asks for nothing in return." The audience stands and applauds for a full minute. Marchione's daughter cries. And somewhere, in the history of innovation and courage and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, Tony Marchione's name is finally recorded where it belongs. Because sometimes, the most important innovations come from the people nobody expects. The mechanics, not the engineers. The observers, not the experts. The ones who trust what they see with their own eyes, even when everyone tells them they're wrong. Tony Marchione was right. And because he was right, thousands of people came home from the war. That's worth remembering.